The stars had watched over Earth for billions of years, silent and distant, and humanity had always looked up at them with wonder and hope. But on that terrible day in March, the stars brought only death in chains. Admiral Zetheron stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and he looked down at the blue planet spinning slowly beneath him. He felt nothing but contempt for the creatures living on its surface. And he had seen 100 species like them before, weak, primitive, and destined for servitude. The galactic hegemony had ruled the galaxy for 40,000 years. And in all that time, they had never encountered a species they could not conquer. 12 elder races controlled everything from the core worlds to the outer rim. And the Velkari Dominion sat at the top of this ancient pyramid of power. Zetheron was Velkari, and his people had perfected the art of subjugation over millennia. They did not see slavery as cruel. They saw it as the natural order of things. And lesser species existed only to serve their betters. His fleet of 300 warships had arrived at Earth just 2 hours ago. And already the primitive electromagnetic signals from below had erupted into chaos. The humans were panicking, just as every other species had panicked when faced with hegemony. Might open a channel to all frequencies, Zetheron commanded. His voice cold and certain, his communications officer obeyed. And within moments, every radio, every television, every phone, and every computer on Earth carried the Admiral's message. Species 7841, designated human, is hereby declared property of the galactic hegemony, he announced without emotion. Resistance is extinction, and compliance is survival. You have one planetary rotation to surrender your governments, your militaries, and your freedom. This is not a negotiation. The transmission ended, and Zetheron turned to watch the planet below. He expected the usual response: confusion, denial, and eventually acceptance, and he was not disappointed. On Earth, the world descended into madness. World leaders scrambled to communicate with each other, and militaries prepared defenses they knew were useless. Some people ran to churches and temples to pray, while others hugged their families and waited for the end. General Mayra Vasquez stood in the underground command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, and she watched the alien transmission play on repeat. She was 53 years old, a veteran of 3 wars, and she had spent her entire life preparing for threats to humanity. But nothing had prepared her for this. What do we have that can reach them? She asked her staff. Colonel James Park shook his head grimly. Nothing that can penetrate their shields, General. Our nuclear arsenal is worthless against ships that can cross galaxies. Mira closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. She had always believed that humanity would meet other intelligent life someday, and she had hoped that meeting would be peaceful. But hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. The world governments fractured within hours. Some nations surrendered immediately, hoping for mercy, while others chose to fight and were destroyed. The hegemony ships fired beams of energy that vaporized entire military bases in seconds. And within 3 days, organized resistance had collapsed. Myra watched cities burn from satellite feeds, and she felt something inside her grow cold and hard. She was not a woman who cried easily, but tears ran down her face as she watched New York disappear in a flash of light. The aliens had decided to make an example of the city that had dared to launch missiles at their ships. We need to evacuate, Colonel Park said quietly. The contingency protocol. I know, Myra interrupted. Activate it now and get everyone on the list to the extraction points. We cannot save everyone, but we can save enough. The contingency protocol was humanity's darkest secret, created decades ago by paranoid generals and visionary scientists. They had always known that first contact might not be friendly, and they had prepared hidden bunkers, secret space stations, and colony ships ready to flee at a moment's notice over the next week. While the hegemony systematically conquered Earth, small groups of humans slipped away into the shadows. They escaped on ships disguised as asteroids, through tunnels that led to hidden launch facilities, and on evacuation vessels that had been waiting in orbit around distant moons. The aliens did not notice. They were too busy processing their new slaves. Myra was one of the last to leave. She stood at the entrance of an underground hangar in Antarctica, and she looked back at the frozen landscape one final time. Earth was lost, but humanity was not yet. "General, we need to go," a young pilot called out. She nodded and walked toward the small stealth ship that would carry her to the asteroid belt, where the remnants of human freedom waited. She did not look back again. There was no point in looking back at a world that was already dead. The hegemony's occupation of Earth was brutal and efficient. Within 3 months, the planet was transformed into what they called a harvest world, and its people were sorted like cattle. The young and strong were shipped to labor camps across the galaxy, while the old and sick were deemed unproductive, and eliminated children were separated from parents, and families were torn apart. The aliens did not understand human bonds, or perhaps they simply did not care. To them, humans were tools, nothing more, and tools did not need love or comfort. Billions suffered in chains, and billions more died in the processing centers. The hegemony had done this to hundreds of species before, and they saw nothing wrong with their actions. This was simply how the galaxy worked, but the hegemony made mistakes. And their greatest mistake was arrogance. They did not destroy Earth completely because they wanted to use it as a breeding ground for more slaves. And they did not hunt down every escaped human because they believed a few scattered survivors were no threat. They were wrong. In the asteroid belt of a forgotten star system, Myra Vasquez gathered the remnants of humanity's military and scientific elite. There were only 50,000 of them, a tiny fraction of the billions who had been enslaved, but they were determined. And they were angry. "We have lost our home," Myra told them in the cargo bay of a converted mining vessel. "We have lost our families, our friends, and our world. The hegemony believes we are broken, and they believe we will fade away into nothing." She paused and looked at the faces around her, faces filled with grief and rage and desperate hope. "They are wrong," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "They wanted slaves, but they will get ghosts instead. We will become the nightmare they never knew they should fear, and we will make them pay for every life they have taken." The crowd was silent for a moment, and then someone began to clap. Others joined in, and soon the cargo bay echoed with the sound of applause and shouts of defiance. The hegemony had conquered Earth in 3 months, and they believed the human problem was solved. But in the darkness between the stars, the survivors were already planning their revenge, and the galaxy would learn that some species should never be enslaved. The war for humanity's soul had just begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. 5 years had passed since the fall of Earth, and the galactic hegemony believed that humanity was nothing more than a useful source of labor. They were wrong, and their ignorance would cost them everything. Captain Dante Reyes crouched in the shadows of a warehouse on the Valkyrie colony world of Desert Prime, and his heart pounded in his chest as 2 alien guards walked past his hiding spot. He held his breath and waited until their footsteps faded into the distance before moving again. He was not supposed to be here. According to hegemony records, he was a slave working in the mines of Sector 7. And no one would ever suspect that a primitive human could infiltrate one of the most secure planets in the galaxy. But that was exactly what he and his team had done. Dante was a member of the Wraith Cells, and these were small groups of humans who had escaped the slave camps and now operated as ghosts within the hegemony. They wore the collars of slaves, spoke the languages of their masters, and moved through the shadows like whispers in the dark. Their mission tonight was simple: destroy the planetary defense grid's backup power, supply, and then disappear before anyone knew they were there. In position, a voice whispered through his earpiece. It was Sergeant Maya Chun, his second-in-command, and she was the best demolitions expert humanity had left. "Proceed on my mark," Dante replied quietly. 3, 2, 1 mark. The explosion was small but precise, and it knocked out the backup generators without triggering any alarms. The hegemony would not notice the damage for hours, and by then, Dante and his team would be long gone. This was how the Ghost War worked: small acts of sabotage that seemed like accidents, assassinations that looked like natural deaths, and viruses that corrupted databases without leaving any trace. The hegemony could not fight an enemy they could not see, and humanity had become invisible across the galaxy. Thousands of similar operations were happening every day. Supply ships vanished in transit, and their cargo was redistributed to rebel groups. Military officers died in their sleep from mysterious illnesses, and key infrastructure failed at critical moments. The hegemony called these incidents statistical anomalies and maintenance failures, but some of their leaders were beginning to suspect the truth. Something was hunting them, and they did not know what it was. General Mira Vasquez watched the latest reports from her command center on New Haven, a hidden station built inside a hollowed-out asteroid. She was older now, her hair gray and her face lined with years of war. But her eyes still burned with the same fire that had kept her going since the day Earth fell. "The race cells have completed 47 operations this month," Colonel Park reported. "All successful, and no casualties on our side." "Good," Myra nodded. "What about the Black Armada?" Admiral Chun reports that we now have 212 ships, and more are being built every day. Our shipyards in the Outer Rim remain undetected. Myra allowed herself a small smile. When they had first fled Earth, they had nothing but hope and rage. Now they had a fleet, and they had allies among the enslaved species who wanted freedom just as desperately as humanity did. But ships and soldiers alone would not win this war. They needed something more, something that would strike fear into the hearts of the hegemony and make them understand that humanity was not just fighting for survival but for vengeance. That something was being developed in a secret laboratory on the far side of the galaxy, and its creator was a woman who had once dedicated her life to saving lives. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had been Earth's leading xenobiologist before the invasion, and she had spent decades dreaming of making peaceful contact with alien species. Those dreams had died along with her husband and children in the processing centers of the hegemony. Now she worked in a sterile lab surrounded by genetic samples and medical equipment. And her work was no longer about saving lives. It was about taking them. "The virus is ready," she told Myra through a secure communication channel. "I have isolated genetic weaknesses in 3 of the 12 founding species, and my weapon will target only them. Other species will be unaffected. Are you certain it works?" Mira asked. Yuki paused for a moment, and her eyes were haunted by something Mira understood all too well: the knowledge that what they were doing was terrible but necessary. "I tested it on prisoners," Yuki admitted quietly. "It works, and there is no cure. Once released, it will spread through their populations like wildfire." Myra nodded slowly. She knew that history would judge them harshly for what they were about to do. But she also knew that history was written by the victors, and she intended to win meanwhile. The hegemony was beginning to wake up to the threat they faced. High Archon Vel Shatir, the supreme leader of the Velkari Dominion and the most powerful being in the galaxy, sat in his throne room and listened to reports that troubled him deeply. 17 supply convoys have disappeared this year alone, his advisor said nervously. "Our intelligence network on the outer colonies has been compromised, and we have lost contact with 3 military outposts in the last month. Rebels," Velshatir growled. "Find them and destroy them. We have tried, High Archon, but the attacks leave no evidence." "It is as if ghosts are responsible." Velshatir's eyes narrowed. He had ruled for over 1,000 years, and he had crushed countless rebellions, but this one was different, and he could feel it in his ancient bones. "The humans," he said suddenly. "This is their doing." His advisor looked surprised. "The humans are slaves, High Archon. They are primitive creatures incapable of such sophisticated attacks. Do not underestimate them," Vel-Shatir replied, and his voice was cold. "They are small and weak, but there is something in their eyes that I have not seen in other species, a fire that refuses to die. Increase security on all human labor camps and eliminate any who show signs of intelligence or defiance." But it was already too late for such measures. The humans were everywhere now, and they were watching, waiting, and preparing for the day when they would strike with all their fury. That day came sooner than anyone expected. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Vengeance of Earth, and she looked out at the fleet she had built from nothing. 200 ships crewed by humans and freed slaves from a dozen species floated in the darkness, waiting for a command. "The time for hiding is over," she told her captains through the communication network. "Tonight, we sent a message to the hegemony, a message they will never forget. The target was the Valkyrie homeworld's defense grid, the most sophisticated security system in the galaxy. No enemy had ever breached it, and the Valkyrie believed it was invincible. They were about to learn otherwise, a small team of human hackers, trained in the arts of electronic warfare, had spent 2 years studying the defense grid. They had found its weaknesses, and they had written a virus that would exploit them at exactly midnight Galactic Standard Time. The virus was uploaded through a compromised communication satellite, and for 17 minutes, the defense grid of the Valkyrie homeworld went completely dark. Nothing happened during those 17 minutes. No attack came, and no bombs fell, and that was the point when the grid came back online. The hegemony found a message written across every screen on the planet. "We can reach you anywhere. Anytime. You should not have enslaved us." Panic spread through the hegemony like a disease. If the humans could shut down the homeworld's defenses, they could do anything, and the galaxy began to understand that the primitives they had dismissed were not primitives at all. In her hidden command center, Mira Vasquez allowed herself another small smile. The war was far from over, but humanity had just announced its presence to the galaxy, and nothing would ever be the same. The ghosts had become an army, and the hegemony would learn to fear them. The hegemony responded to the humiliation of their homeworld with terrible fury, and they assembled the largest fleet in galactic history. 1,000 warships gathered at the edge of hegemony space, and their mission was simple: find the humans and destroy them all. Admiral Zethoran, the same officer who had conquered Earth 5 years ago, was given command of this purification fleet. He had underestimated humanity once, and he swore he would not make that mistake again. Find their hiding places, he ordered his scouts. Burn every asteroid, search every moon, and leave no corner of space unexplored. I want every human in this galaxy dead or in chains. The hunt began, and for 3 months, the purification fleet swept through the outer territories. They destroyed hidden bases, captured refugee ships, and executed thousands of humans without mercy, but they could not find the Black Armada Admiral. Chen Wei-Lin had expected this response, and she had prepared for it. Her fleet moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few days, and they used the chaos of the hegemony search to strike at undefended targets behind enemy lines. But she knew that running could not last forever. Sooner or later, they would have to stand and fight, and she had chosen the perfect place for that battle at Tartarus. Nebula was a massive cloud of gas and radiation at the edge of known space. It was beautiful and deadly, and its swirling colors hid dangers that even the hegemony feared: sensor interference, unpredictable gravity wells, and radiation that could fry electronics in seconds. No sane commander would fight a battle there. And that was exactly why Chun chose it. They outnumber us 5-1, Captain Reyes said during the War Council. Even with the nebula on our side, those are terrible odds. Numbers do not win wars, Chun replied calmly. The hegemony has never faced an enemy like us. They fight with formations and protocols and rules. We fight with rage and sacrifice and the knowledge that we have nothing left to lose. She looked around at her officers, humans, and freed slaves from a dozen species who had joined the rebellion. They were tired and scared, but their eyes held the same determination that had kept humanity alive for 5 years. The galaxy is watching. She continued. Enslaved species on 1,000 worlds are waiting to see if we can win. And if we show them that the hegemony can be beaten, they will rise up, and we will no longer be alone in this fight. The battle plan was risky, but brilliant. The Black Armada would lure the Purification Fleet into the nebula, where their superior numbers and technology would be neutralized, and then they would fight with tactics the hegemony had never seen before. The trap was sprung on a cold morning in Galactic Standard Time, Zetherons. Scouts detected the Black Armada at the edge of the Taurus Nebula, and he ordered his fleet to pursue immediately. He did not stop to think about why the humans had revealed themselves, and he did not consider that he might be walking into a trap. His arrogance was about to cost him everything. The Black Armada retreated into the nebula, and the Purification Fleet followed. Within hours, the hegemony ships were deep inside the cloud, and their sensors were blind, and that was when Chun struck. Human ships emerged from the gas clouds like phantoms, firing torpedoes and missiles before disappearing again. They attacked in small groups, hitting vulnerable targets and then retreating before the enemy could respond. The hegemony tried to form defensive formations, but the nebula's interference made coordination impossible. Ships that had never fought without perfect communication suddenly found themselves alone and confused, and then came the tactics that truly horrified the hegemony. Human pilots flew suicide runs into enemy hangars, detonating their ships inside and destroying dozens of fighters at once. Boarding parties fought to the last soldier, holding critical positions until they were killed and taking 10 aliens with them for every human lost. Wounded ships rammed into enemy bridges instead of surrendering. The hegemony had never encountered an enemy willing to die so readily, and they did not know how to respond. They are insane, Zetheron gasped as he watched another of his cruisers explode from a kamikaze attack. No species fights like this. No species values victory over survival, but humanity did. And the galaxy was about to learn that lesson. The Battle of Taurus lasted 9 days, and it was the bloodiest conflict in galactic history. The Black Armada lost 150 ships, and thousands of humans died, but the hegemony lost 600 vessels. Including Zetheron's flagship, the Admiral escaped on a shuttle moments before the Eternal Dominion was destroyed, and he watched in disbelief as the primitives he had conquered celebrated their victory. But the battle itself was only part of Chun's plan. The real weapon was information. Human hackers had hijacked broadcast frequencies across the galaxy, and the entire battle was transmitted live to every enslaved world in the hegemony. Billions of beings who had lived in chains for generations watched as their masters' finest fleet was torn apart by the species they had dismissed as primitive. The effect was immediate and devastating on the Drexy homeworld. Enslaved workers seized control of a weapons factory and began arming themselves. On Soloria, prisoners in labor camps overwhelmed their guards and escaped into the wilderness. On 100 other planets, species who had been too afraid to resist suddenly found their courage. General Vasquez's message was broadcast alongside the battle footage. The chains are only as strong as your belief in them. Break them, and break free. The hegemony suddenly found itself fighting a war on 100 fronts, and they did not have the forces to contain them all. The rebellion spread like fire through dry grass, and the empire that had stood for 40,000 years began to crack high Archon. Velshatir watched the chaos unfold from his throne room, and for the first time in his 1,000-year life, he felt something he had never felt before: fear. How is this possible? He demanded of his advisors. They are primitive insects, and yet they have brought our empire to the edge of collapse. The humans are unlike any species we have encountered, one advisor replied nervously. They do not surrender when defeated. They do not break under torture, and they do not fear death. They fight with a fury that defies all logic. Then we will show them true fury. Velshatir growled, and his ancient eyes blazed with hatred. If they will not be our slaves, they will be our ashes. Prepare the Genesis weapon. The room fell silent. The Genesis weapon was an artifact from the early days of the hegemony, a device capable of rendering entire planets uninhabitable, and it had not been used in 20,000 years because even the hegemony considered it too terrible. High Archon, the advisor said carefully. The Genesis weapon will kill billions, not just humans, but all life on the target world. I know, Velshatir replied coldly, and I do not care. If we cannot have Earth as a harvest world, we will have it as a grave, and the humans will watch their homeworld die before we hunt down every last one of them. The order was given, and the Genesis weapon was loaded onto a convoy of 50 heavily armored ships. Their destination was Earth, and their mission was extinction across the galaxy. Intelligence operatives in the human resistance intercepted the message, and they transmitted it to General Vasquez with trembling hands. Myra read the report 3 times before she believed it. The hegemony was going to destroy Earth, the world that still held 2 billion of her people in chains. How long do we have? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. 3 weeks, Colonel Park replied. The convoy is heavily guarded, and we cannot intercept them in time. Myra closed her eyes and felt the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on her shoulders. She could not save Earth, and she could not stop the Genesis weapon, but she could make sure that those who order it would pay the price. Contact Dr. Tanaka, she said finally. Tell her that Operation Prometheus is a go. The room grew very quiet, and everyone understood what those words meant. The war was about to enter its final and most terrible phase, and the galaxy would burn before it was over. The Genesis weapon convoy moved through space like a funeral procession, and 50 warships surrounded the ancient device that would end all life on Earth. The hegemony had used this weapon only twice before in their history, and both times it had left worlds as barren as dead moons. General Myra Vasquez stood in her command center and watched the convoy's progress on a holographic display. Every hour that passed brought the weapon closer to Earth, and every hour felt like a knife twisting in her heart. 2 billion humans still lived on Earth, slaves who worked in the mines and factories of their conquerors, families who prayed every night for rescue that would never come, children who had been born in chains and knew nothing else. She could not save them, and that knowledge was destroying her. The Black Armada cannot intercept the convoy in time, Admiral Chun reported through a secure channel. Their escort is too strong, and we are too far away. I know, Myra replied quietly, but that is not our mission. Our mission is to make sure this never happens again. Operation Prometheus had been created for exactly this moment, the moment when humanity had nothing left to lose and no reason to hold back. 17 teams of volunteers had been preparing for years, and now they were moving into position on the homeworlds of the 12 founding species of the hegemony. Each team carried a variant of Dr. Tanaka's bioweapon, engineered specifically for their target species. Each volunteer knew they would not survive, and each one had accepted that sacrifice gladly. Captain Dante Reyes led the team bound for the Volcari homeworld, and he thought about his family, as his ship slipped through the enemy's defenses. His wife and daughter had been taken to Earth's processing center 7 years ago, and he had never seen them again, but he knew in his heart that they were dead, just like so many others. "We are in position," he reported to General Vasquez. Awaiting final authorization, Myra closed her eyes for a moment and thought about everything that had led to this point: the invasion, the slavery, the death camps, the billions who had suffered and died. And she thought about the billions more who would die once she gave the order. She was about to commit the greatest act of mass murder in galactic history, and she knew that. She would burn in hell for it, but she also knew that she would do it anyway, because the alternative was to let humanity die as slaves. "All teams are in position," she said finally. "Hold for my signal." The Genesis weapon convoy reached Earth on a cold Tuesday morning, and 2 billion humans looked up at the sky and saw their death approaching. Some prayed, some cried, and some simply held their loved ones close. But none of them could escape. High Archon Vel-Shatir watched the operation from his throne room, and a cruel smile crossed his ancient face. He had waited months for this moment, and he intended to enjoy every second of it. "Activate the Genesis weapon," he commanded. The weapon fired a beam of energy that struck Earth's atmosphere like a hammer, and the effect was immediate and terrible. The air itself became poison, and everything that breathed began to die: humans and animals and plants, all choking on an atmosphere that had turned against them. Cities fell silent as their populations collapsed in the streets. Forests withered and died in minutes, and oceans turned black as the creatures within them perished. And across the galaxy, humans watched the murder of their homeworld on hijacked broadcasts. Myra Vasquez watched too, and tears streamed down her face as Earth died. She saw the last satellite images of cities she had known, parks where she had played as a child, and mountains she had climbed as a young soldier, all of it dying, all of it lost forever. 2 billion screams echoed across space. And then there was only silence. "Give the signal," Myra whispered, and her voice was like ice across the galaxy. 17 teams received her order, and they moved without hesitation. Dr. Tanaka's bioweapons were released into the air, the water, and the food supplies of the 12 homeworlds, colorless, odorless, and utterly deadly. But these weapons did not kill quickly. Tanaka had designed them to spread first and strike later, and by the time symptoms appeared, it would be far too late to stop them. High Archon Vel-Shatir was still celebrating the destruction of Earth when the first reports arrived. Strange illnesses had appeared on several hegemony homeworlds, and their doctors could not identify them, because he dismissed the reports as coincidence and continued his celebration. But within a week, the coincidence had become a catastrophe. The plague struck the Volcari hardest. Their immune systems were ancient and slow to adapt, and the virus tore through their population like fire through paper. Millions died in the first week, and hundreds of millions more were infected on the Kashan homeworld. Similar scenes unfolded. Hospitals overflowed with the dying, and entire cities were quarantined. But the quarantines came too late, and the virus had already spread beyond control. Report after report flooded into Vel-Shatir's throne room. 12 homeworlds, 12 plagues, and billions of his people dying in agony. He finally understood what had happened, and the realization filled him with horror. "The humans," he gasped. "They have killed us all." His advisors fled in panic, seeking cures that did not exist, while the High Archon sat on his throne and watched his empire crumble. He had wanted to teach humanity a lesson about defiance, but instead, humanity had taught him a lesson about vengeance. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin launched her attack 3 days later, when the hegemony was too busy dying to defend itself. The Black Armada emerged from hiding, joined by rebel fleets from a dozen freed species, and they struck at the heart of the enemy. Military stations were destroyed, shipyards were captured, and entire systems fell to the rebels in a matter of days. The hegemony tried to organize a defense, but their leadership was dying and their communications were in chaos. Captain Reyes led the assault on the Valkyrie throne world himself. His team fought through the streets of the capital, past the bodies of plague victims, until they reached the palace gates, and there they found the surviving Valkyrie soldiers making their last stand. The battle was brutal and bloody, but Reyes did not care. He had lost everything: his family, his world, his future, and he had nothing left but vengeance. When the palace gates fell, he walked alone through the empty halls until he found the throne room. High Archon Velshatir sat on his throne, covered in the lesions of Dr. Tanaka's plague. Too weak to stand, but too proud to hide. "You have come to kill me," the Archon said, and his voice was a hollow whisper. "No," Reyes replied, looking at the dying monster who had ordered the enslavement of his people. "The plague will do that. I have come to watch." "Why?" Velshatir coughed, blood dripping from his lips. "Why did you do this? You have killed billions, and for what?" "You could have left us alone," Reyes said simply. "You could have passed by our little planet and let us live in peace, but you chose to make us slaves, and you chose to destroy our world." He stepped closer, and his eyes were cold as space itself. "We were never slaves," he continued. "We were a warning you did not understand, and now you understand it too late." Velshatir's eyes widened, and, for a moment, Reyes saw something that might have been regret, but then the light faded, and the High Archon of the Valkyrie Dominion died on his throne, the last ruler of an empire that had stood for 40,000 years. Reyes stood there for a long time, looking at the body of his enemy, and he felt nothing, no satisfaction, no triumph, no relief, only emptiness. The war was almost over, and humanity had won, but at what cost? He thought of Earth, burning and dead, and he thought of the billions of aliens who were dying across the galaxy because of what humanity had unleashed, and he wondered if they had truly won or simply ensured that everyone lost. Outside the palace, the sun was setting on a dying world, and the sky was painted with colors that might have been beautiful if they were not the colors of extinction. 20 years had passed since the fall of the hegemony, and the galaxy was a very different place, quieter, emptier, and haunted by the ghosts of the dead. The galactic hegemony no longer existed. Its great fleets were scattered wreckage floating in the void. Its mighty stations were abandoned ruins, and its once proud species were shadows of what they had been. 8 of the 12 founding species were completely extinct. Dr. Tanaka's bioweapons had done their work too well, and mutations had spread the plagues beyond their intended targets. Secondary infections crossed species barriers, and worlds that should have been safe became mass graves instead. The remaining 4 founding species survived, but barely. Their populations were decimated, their empires shattered, and their survivors scattered across a galaxy that no longer feared them. The masters had become refugees, and they lived at the mercy of the species they had once enslaved. Humanity survived too, but the cost of victory was written in numbers that could not be fully understood before the invasion. 12 billion humans had lived on Earth and its colonies. Now only 3 billion remained, scattered across 1,000 stations, ships, and borrowed worlds. They had won their freedom, but they had lost their home and most of their people in the process. Earth was a tomb now. Its atmosphere remained poisonous, and its surface was covered with the remains of cities that had once been full of life. It would take centuries for the planet to heal, if it ever did, and no human could set foot there without dying. Admiral Chen Weilin, who had led the Black Armada to victory, was now the leader of what remained of humanity. She had never wanted this responsibility, but someone had to rebuild what had been destroyed, and she had earned the trust of her people. 2 years of war, she established the new compact, an alliance of freed species who had fought alongside humanity against the hegemony. It was not an empire, and it had no slaves or masters, only equals who had agreed to protect each other from any threat. The headquarters of the new compact was New Terra Station, a massive structure built in the asteroid belt where the Resistance had been born. Its walls were covered with memorials to the dead, and the largest memorial stretched for miles. It contained the names of every human who had died on Earth when the Genesis weapon struck 2 billion names, carved in stone that would last forever. Chun walked through the memorial on the 20th anniversary of the liberation, as the survivors called it, and she read the names of people she had known. She found her parents' names near the end of the first section, and she touched the cold stone gently. "I'm sorry I could not save you," she whispered. "I am sorry I could not save any of you." A voice spoke behind her. "You saved the ones who could be saved. That is more than most could have done." She turned and saw General Vasquez standing there, leaning on a cane. Mira was old now, her body worn down by years of war and grief, and her eyes carried a weight that never seemed to lift. "Did we do the right thing?" Chun asked, the question she had been carrying for 20 years finally escaping her lips. "We killed billions, not just hegemony soldiers, but civilians, children, innocent beings who had nothing to do with our enslavement." Myra was silent for a long moment, and then she shook her head slowly. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have asked myself that question every day since I gave the order, and I still do not have an answer. I know that if we had done nothing, humanity would have been exterminated. And I know that what we did saved our species, but I also know that we became monsters to defeat monsters. And I do not know if our souls can ever be clean again." They stood together in the memorial, surrounded by the names of the dead, and neither of them spoke. There were no words that could capture what they had done or what it had cost them. In another part of the station, Dr. Yuki Tanaka sat in a small laboratory, surrounded by screens and equipment. She was dying now, the radiation from her years of work having finally caught up with her, and she spent her final days trying to undo what she had created. She had developed cures for 3 of the plagues, saving those species from complete extinction, and she considered that her penance, but she knew it would never be enough. She had killed more beings than any other person in galactic history, and no amount of atonement could balance that scale. A young assistant entered the lab with a tray of medication. "Dr. Tanaka, you should rest. You have been working for 18 hours. Yuki shook her head. "I will rest when I am dead, and that will be soon enough for now. There is work to do." She looked at the genetic samples on her screen, the Verteth species, the last of her targets that still had no cure, and she felt the familiar mixture of guilt and determination that had driven her for 20 years. "I did not enjoy what I did," she said quietly, more to herself than to her assistant. "I created those weapons because I believed there was no other way, but I never stopped hating myself for it." The assistant did not know how to respond, so she simply left the medication on the desk and departed. Yuki continued working, her fingers moving across the controls with practiced precision, and she prayed silently that she would finish this final cure before death claimed her. She did not. She died 3 weeks later, surrounded by her research, and her assistant completed the work in her name. The Verteth were saved, and Yuki Tanaka's legacy became one of destruction and salvation. Forever intertwined, General Vasquez died 2 years after Tanaka, peacefully in her sleep. She had refused every honor offered to her, every title and medal and statue. She said she did not deserve them, and she meant it. Her last words were recorded by the nurse who attended her. "Tell them it was not worth it. Tell them to find another way." Those words were carved beneath her name on the memorial wall, and they became a lesson that humanity taught to every child born in the new compact. The galaxy was different now in ways that went beyond politics and borders. Half of the civilizations that had existed before the war were gone, And the great cities of the elder races were empty ruins that explorers, sometimes visited but never stayed in, the trade routes had collapsed. And the knowledge networks had been destroyed. Technology that had been common was now rare. And skills that had been widespread were now forgotten. It would take generations to rebuild what had been lost, but among the survivors, there was also hope. New species had risen from the ashes of the old. Freed from chains they had worn for millennia, they built new societies based on freedom and equality. And they looked to humanity as both saviors and warnings. The younger species, those who had been enslaved, those who had rebelled, those who had fought beside humanity, taught their children a lesson that would be remembered for thousands of years. They told their children about the humans, how they had been small and primitive, how they had been conquered and enslaved, how they had seemed broken and hopeless, and how they had risen from their chains with a fury that shattered an empire. Never enslave them, the teacher said. Never corner them. Never take everything from them. Never give them a reason to show you what they truly are, because when humanity has nothing left to lose, the stars themselves will weep, and in the halls of the new compact, where the survivors gathered to remember and rebuild, humans and aliens alike looked out at the stars and wondered what the future would hold. The war was over, and the hegemony was gone, but the universe was vast and dark, and new threats would always emerge. The only question was whether the lessons of the past would be remembered. Admiral Chun Wei-lin gave one final speech on the 50th anniversary of the liberation. Her voice carried across 1,000 worlds to billions of beings who had never known slavery. "We won," she said simply. "We won, and we survived, but let us never forget what that victory cost us. And let us never forget what we became in order to win it." She paused, looking out at the assembled crowd, humans and freed species, young and old, all of them carrying the weight of history on their shoulders. "Let the galaxy remember what happened when they tried to enslave humanity," she concluded. "And let us remember that we have a responsibility to be better than our enemies, or we must be guardians, not conquerors and protectors, not destroyers. That is the only way our victory can truly mean something." The crowd was silent for a long moment, and then someone began to applaud. The applause spread, growing louder and louder, until it filled the great hall like thunder, and Chun nodded once before stepping down from the podium. The war was over. But the work of building a better galaxy had just begun, and humanity, scarred and changed and forever haunted by what they had done, would lead that work because they had learned something in the darkness of slavery and the fire of vengeance. They had learned that strength without mercy was just another form of tyranny, and that freedom without justice was just another kind of chains. The stars would remember humanity's fury, but they would also remember humanity's hope, and in the end, that hope was the greatest victory of all.